Hello, and welcome to the He Said, She Said podcast. I'm Doug Austin, editor of eDiscovery Today, and I'm the He Said.
And I'm Christy Burke, president and founder of Burke & Company, LLC, and I'm the She Said.
Welcome to our podcast, where we'll discuss interesting and educational trends within the legal and eDiscovery communities. Today's podcast is about modernizing legal technology education. And we have 4 industry thought leaders who are also leaders in trying to address that legal technology education challenge that many legal professionals are facing today. Christy, would you like to introduce our panelists?
Yes, Doug, I'd love to. Thanks. So legal technology education is one of the unsung heroes and biggest pitfalls that impact the success of technology in helping law firms and their clients. So we are incredibly fortunate to have this distinguished panel of speakers today who can address this topic from many different vantage points. So let's meet the panel. First, we have Bonnie Beuth. Bonnie is an information systems trainer at law firm Ford Harrison, and she's also the founding member and board chair of LTC4, a nonprofit legal tech education certifications company. Then we have Catlin or Kat Moon, who is a practicing attorney and director of legal innovation design at Vanderbilt Law School's program in law and innovation, also called POLI. Next, we have Mike Quartararo, who's president of ACEDS, the Association of eDiscovery Specialists. And finally, last but not least, we have Memme Onwudiwe, who is executive vice president and co-founder of Evisort, an AI contract intelligence tech provider. So we're going to get into this topic first by asking a question of all the panelists to sound off on the greatest trends and challenges in legal tech education that they've been seeing. And we're going to then ask them individual questions to leverage their unique expertise. Finally, we're going to ask them for some takeaways and a look to the future. And we really are grateful to them for participating today. We're going to start with a question for all 4 of them. We're going to start with you, Bonnie. The question is, from your perspective, what is the state of legal technology education today? And what are the advantages to lawyers for educating themselves about legal technology, and what are the greatest obstacles to progress? So Bonnie, please, if you could answer that question.
Sure. So the historic resistance to tech training really changed during the pandemic, particularly for attorneys. They realized that they needed skills. They don't have legal assistants sitting outside their doors, right? During the pandemic, they're at home, so they need to know how to do this. In my own firm, it was interesting. I had a number of attorneys contact me for time entry training because they couldn't hand a piece of paper to their legal assistants anymore. And it ultimately answered the argument of whether attorneys need training, because they took the training, they did their own time entry, they ended up doing it much more contemporaneously. But beyond that, when their legal assistants were sitting outside their doors again, they still continue to do their own time entry. The advantage of technology training for lawyers is and always has been really understanding the ethical and practical implications of how technology affects the practice of law. The biggest obstacle, of course, is that the technology changes quickly, and it takes time to learn how to use it and become efficient. But I think that creates also an interesting paradox, because the fact of the matter is, if you take the time to learn how to use that technology efficiently, you then save time potentially for billable hours on not struggling with that technology, because then you know how to use it. You know, in spite of the fact that the pandemic really showed a need for technology training, particularly among lawyers, it's still the number of areas where there are skills gaps: security, collaboration, email management, and actually it's still in the hybrid remote working environment.
Great, thanks, Bonnie. Kat, what about you?
So my perspective is in a law school and working with law students. And so it's a little bit different. Obviously, COVID caused us all to pivot to virtual platforms for delivering content and so forth, but it didn't impact, I think, students' orientation to the work in the same way that the impact Bonnie was just describing had. I think for me, fundamentally, legal tech education at the law student level is about helping law students understand that technology is a superpower and that it augments their lawyer superpowers. And so it's helping them develop a healthy mindset and curiosity around technology and how it can help them thrive and succeed. So it's less about training on specific platforms because my students go to all kinds of different places. And so I can orient them to types of technology, but beyond that, training them, except maybe on the Microsoft suite. I think that's pretty ubiquitous, but training them on particular technologies really isn't the best and highest use of my time and their effort. So I think today, law schools who are doing it well are exposing students to technology, helping them understand how it can augment their lawyer superpowers, and helping them develop a healthy curiosity so that when they go into the practice, instead of being overwhelmed by the new technology they have to learn, they're excited and curious about it. I will finally say, once you enter the practice, it's fantastic that 38 or 39 states have this requirement that you be abreast of technology as part of your competency ethical obligation. What that actually means is very unclear. And so I think it will always be on the individual lawyer as part of our ethical obligation to develop and maintain that curiosity and continue to educate themselves, not wait for employers or rely on other people, but to be individually self-motivated. I think that's our ethical obligation. So, to follow up on what Bonnie said, I think COVID has empowered and really inspired a lot of people to do that. I'll stop talking.
Thanks, Kat. That's great. Mike, what about you?
So I agree with Bonnie and Kat. I think that COVID has accelerated technology adoption and education. However, I'm gonna be a little contrary and just say I still think of it as a work in progress, and for a couple of reasons. Well, first of all, I think that sort of e-discovery always kind of sort of dominates the technology conversation when it comes to learning and education. Maybe that's just because that's the space I sort of toil in. But there's a whole host, as Bonnie pointed out, of other technologies that can really enable lawyers to practice better, more efficiently, more cost effectively, and ensure better outcomes for clients. And that's ultimately the goal. So I think there's like an overemphasis on e-discovery, but it's not the only technology game in town. There's so many things like, and I know we're going to talk about law school education and we'll get to that, but I feel like it really starts back then. And if we don't have the foundations for what they can anticipate in practice when they get to that firm or that government regulatory agency or wherever they're going to work, lawyers in particular are gonna struggle in their practice, and that doesn't even cover what happens with like paralegals, legal assistants, legal secretaries, all those things. So, end of the day, I'm calling it a work in progress only because while I'm optimistic, I definitely think there's still work to be done.
Thanks, Mike. Well, speaking of law school education, we have Memme who's going to go next. And Memme actually was a law student just a few years ago and then was co-founder of a legal tech company and is now an EVP at the company. So Memme, can you tell us your point of view, having been a law school student just a few years ago and now working at a legal tech company as one of the execs?
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, I think a lot of the issues kind of in this space have been brought up by other folks. I think one angle to maybe add to is that when you think about law schools and technology, and I think the better ones aren't doing this, but I think this is kind of where a lot of folks start. They think about how the law affects technology, right? And so even look at, Harvard, the Burke and Klein Center, looking at things like, hey, how will facial recognition change with these new policies about facial recognition, right? How are people going to move, their data and change their data practices due to these updates in data privacy law, right? With GDPR, right? And so really looking at how law affects technology. And I think, as others mentioned, there just needs to be more focus on how technology affects law, right? Because in reality, the work that we are all doing every day as lawyers is changing because of technology. And if law school isn't the place to investigate that, then where is the place that we're going to be kind of looking at that, learning about that, coming into best practices and stuff like that. So I think kind of flipping it a little bit and having law schools more interested in how technology is changing the practice of law from law firms to in-house abroad, I think could be a good pivot point for folks to think about.
Right, great, thanks, Memme. Okay, Bonnie, we have a question just for you. So let's talk about legal technology at law firms, which is one of your specialties. How did the pandemic change legal tech education at law firms? You did mention some of this, but I'd like to hear more in depth from you. And why do you think they are still not getting the maximum return on investment, the ROI from their technology purchases? Why do you think this keeps happening again and again?
Well, I think it's interesting. Law firms spend a staggering amount of money keeping up with the latest trends in technology and implementing that, but they still haven't focused on measuring their success. Some firms have measured their success with training. So DLA Piper, for instance, rolled out LTC4 certification. And when they did that, they also coupled it with a case study on the value of that training, tracked it and were able to prove it. It is interesting that the industry as a whole, though, doesn't seem to have a consistent method or priority on measuring that return on investment. The pandemic, of course, proved that attorneys need training, right? And tech training rose to that occasion. There is an overwhelming amount of online on, remote access training that's now available. It's been proven to be very effective. In a work from home environment, that just-in-time training is really critical. I think what it comes down to is that for years, the conversation has been around project managers trying to cost out project management. And until legal project managers are willing to place a value on the efficacy and efficiency of technology, you're never going to find out what that cost is. What the pandemic changed, interestingly, is that now you've got so many attorneys working from home that if they need a technology answer, they need on-demand training. And this may ultimately prove the path for project managers to put a value on technology efficiency and proficiency. On-demand and workflow-based training is now critical. Attorneys have to have an answer. They have to have an answer now. They can't reach out to the help desk as much or call out to their legal assistants to do something that they can't otherwise do. LTC4 was ahead of its time when it comes to this on-demand and workflow task-based training. We focused our whole effort on getting attorneys engaged in technology training. And so we took a workflow approach. We took the approach that any firm could take a competency and apply it to any technology. Particularly, when Kat references the fact that law schools, don't necessarily have the ability to focus on a particular technology. I mean, you couldn't, right? And those law students are going out to use any document management system and, well, largely the Microsoft tools, but so many other tools that are specific to law firms. LTC4 certification also proves, or is one form of proof, that an attorney has effectively and efficiently used that technology. And again, what I said earlier is that the time that it takes for that training really gains you time in the long run. So, this method of just-in-time learning may be the end finally for project managers to get down to what a matter actually costs. And that's ultimately what technology training is about. It's about profitability.
Great, thanks, Bonnie. Let's pivot to Kat actually to talk about law schools. And obviously, as Kat and Bonnie and others have said, law schools are perpetually challenged in offering their students technology education, for many reasons, both while in school and then after graduation as continuing ed options. Why do you think, Kat, this is such a difficult issue, and what do you think might be the best solution to the problem?
So I will point back to something Memme said. I think he hit on a fundamental issue, really attention. So the traditional model of legal education is one that focuses on doctrine. And so a lot of law schools have gotten actually pretty deep into the law of technology because that's doctrine. That is thinking like a lawyer, and that's a comfortable space. So the other piece, the flip side of that, the technology of law and law practice and how technology is impacting how we do our work, doesn't really fit neatly within the paradigm of traditional legal education. And so there's, I think, a tension there. And if you also look at the traditional model of how legal education is delivered, technology doesn't fit neatly within that either. So it often is approached as an add-on. So for instance, at my school, we have the program on law and innovation, which really is all about how innovation and technology impacts how we deliver legal services, but it's all add-on, right? These are all courses that are that people can take and choose to add on to the traditional curriculum. I think that is the typical approach. It's an add-on. So the real opportunity is, how do we imbue teaching students to think like a lawyer using technology? How do we actually include it in how they learn and what they learn so that it becomes a natural part of how they do what they do? I think that's the real opportunity. It is also probably one of the biggest challenges because that's not how we do things right now. So I don't have a good answer for it, even though I have a grand vision of what it could look like.
Too bad we were hoping for a quick fix, Kat. Sounds like a much bigger problem than one podcast can solve.
If only, right?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, well, I'm going to turn it over to Doug now to continue on with the further questions. Doug, over to you.
Great, thanks, Christy. So Mike, this next question's for you. In eDiscovery Today's 2022 State of the Industry report, 30% of respondents cited lack of eDiscovery confidence as by far the biggest eDiscovery challenge not enough people are talking about. And that certainly, of course, includes knowledge of technology. Yet people are talking about it and trying to address that challenge every day. You and I are among those people doing that. So what do you think it will take for more people to take advantage of all the educational resources that are already out there?
You know, Doug, I think that the issue here is, well, there's a couple of issues. And the unfortunate truth here is that people don't realize it's a problem until it's a problem. And, you know, we've all seen the case decisions where, you know, some firm or lawyer gets into a dispute, a discovery dispute, let's just say, and the judge says, you know what, go get some training, or go get, you know, go fix this, or even worse, they get into a problem with their client. There's a data issue or you know, an integrity issue, and they wind up, you know, in a dispute with their own client. And those are the kinds of events that, in my experience, have really driven firms to make a change and become more technology competent, let's just say, particularly in the e-discovery space, which is fairly risky. But that aside, and that does happen, we've all seen it. To me, it's really a question of time, right? And when I say time, I don't mean more time, more people will learn. I mean, people don't have time to learn the technology. That's one of the big obstacles. And that's why I think that large number of people are saying that there's a lack of competence, particularly in e-discovery, because nobody's really focused on it. You know, I know in the legal operations world, which I touch a little bit of, you know, e-discovery is way down the list of priorities. It's not a top, it's not even in the top 10, right? And so when they face a crisis, they get jammed up and they're looking for solutions. And if they had just taken the time to educate themselves, to train, to learn technology, to learn whatever tool is appropriate for the circumstance, that would go a long way towards solving those problems before they start. And I have to just go back finally to the law school education piece, because I really think that's the foundation. If they get some of this training coming out of law school, they will be less lost when they get into practice, wherever they practice, whether it's corporate, a law firm, the government, or even some alternative. So I really think that the emphasis needs to be placed on teaching technology and e-discovery more specifically in law school.
Yeah, I agree. Of course, those e-discovery disaster stories are kind of the bread and butter of my blog in some instances, but hey, it is what it is. So, Memme, let's take a look at the issue from a vendor perspective. How are legal tech vendors helping to provide educational opportunities to the legal industry?
Yeah, I mean, I would say not enough. And if you look at it from a legal tech vendor, and I think this is the same for in-house lawyers too, when folks graduate law school today, I'd say the vast majority expect to kind of go directly into law firms, right? Even though we have a legal industry landscape that's very different than it was 20 years ago, in that, the biggest folks around, law firms are still big, yes, but legal in-house teams have grown significantly in the last 20 years. And as you know, legal tech companies and legal tech vendors have raised billions of dollars in the last 20 years as well. So I think that the fact that the average law student graduating sees just one path on the other end of law firms, I think legal tech vendors and in-house lawyers can do more to create more opportunities for young law students to take their career paths in separate ways from the beginning. Now, to answer your question directly, legal tech vendors, I think historically have been known to engage with, law schools through, things like providing their technology to students, a LexisNexis, a Westlaw kind of way, to help them with training as they're there. I think more and more, especially as you see more legal tech vendors these days support in-house lawyers, right? And support corporate legal teams. And the fact that, as I just said, lots of students do not start their careers in-house lawyers, right? They go through several years of a law firm before going into in-house. That kind of limits how much we can really work with those students, because the things we're training them on aren't things that they will be using day to day until years into their career, the way that the current pathways are typically set up now. And so, I mean, you'll find that like me and our CEO, and this is because also we recently, graduated from law school, but we're going back and lecturing a course at Harvard Law School, on legal technology, on startup entrepreneurship, right? Because I think something else, when we talk about flipping the script on legal education, in law school, you're often taught how to support entrepreneurs, how to, help out, startups, how to, support their needs, but not much on how to be an entrepreneur yourself, right? And so we're going to be teaching some of those principles. And then that's, I think, deep within being a lawyer. I think a solo practitioner, can be seen as an entrepreneur themselves, right? And kind of reclaiming a little bit of that space as well. But I'd say legal tech vendors, I think, can do more. And I guess one last thing that we're doing is we have a fellowship program where we actually have law students working with us throughout the school year. And we've actually hired many afterwards where they come directly into Evisort. They don't have to take the bar. And if you look at our company, we built this company as law students, right? The CEO was a 2L when I was a 1L, and the CTO was a PhD at MIT. And so we know that law students have the capabilities to work throughout our organization, because if that wasn't the case, we literally wouldn't be a company, right? And so we're very confident in, law students, even though early in their careers, being able to have impacts, not just review NDAs for hours on end for the first 3 years of their career. So.
Yeah, that's great. And some of the things you talk about are a great lead into this next question. And this question is for all four of you. Do you see a major difference in legal technology education interest for lawyers with law firm positions versus corporate in-house legal roles? Bonnie, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to the billable hour, right? So law firms don't have, or law firms have that priority on racking up billable hours, whereas in corporate legal departments, they can spend the time more to focus on what the value is of that technology and learning that technology without having that time pressure. I think that's the critical difference between the two.
All right. Kat, what's your perspective on that?
So I agree that the incentives in law firms are less likely to produce folks who are going after technology learning opportunities. I will also say, and I will say that the same thing can happen in a legal department because everybody's crushed with work. So you might not have to bill a certain number of hours, but you are crushed with work. And so how do folks incentivize? I don't really have a good answer. My observation is the folks who come into the practice really curious and interested personally in learning and continuous improvement tend to be those who leverage technology just individually, right? So for me, it comes back around to it depends on the individual, and it also depends on your role. Some roles are just more inclined to pursue those opportunities.
All right. So Mike, what about your perspective? What have you seen from the standpoint of e-discovery and ACEDS?
Well, I mean, I spent 20 years in big law, and I had an opportunity, of course, to work with a lot of legal corporate legal departments as well. So I think that my take on this is really one of reactive versus proactive. And it varies across the law firm spectrum depending upon size and resources. But certainly on the big law side, I think that firms have gotten a little bit more proactive in the use of technology and even in technology education. Whereas on the legal operations side, I feel like they're staffed a little less adequately, and it's more of a reactive situation. And I also think that both law firms and corporate legal, frankly, everywhere in the industry, is nobody really takes the time anymore to say, I have this problem, and how do is there a tool that solves my problem, rather than just bringing in technology and saying this technology fixes these problems. You really have to assess what your problems are before you start looking for technology solutions. And I think that we just haven't done a good job of that. The marketing arm of legal technology has kind of pushed technology out to us and said, here, this helps you. And then law firms and corporate legal are left to figure out sort of, how do I make this work for me? And does it solve my problem? So there's some interesting challenges there. It's probably a conversation that's much wider than we're willing to go right now. So.
Sure. And certainly from a law school perspective, Kat points out, of course, that Vanderbilt does have a dedicated e-discovery course. Not a lot of law schools out there necessarily do, but kudos to them for being one of the ones that does. So certainly notable there. So Memme, you've already talked about this topic in your in the last question, but anything you have to add regarding the kind of the law firm versus corporate aspect of training and education?
Yeah. I mean, I did talk about it a little bit there, and sorry for jumping the gun a little bit there, but I think one thing when we think about the incentives to teach these courses, right? And so I think that the reason I think it's so important that you have more in-house teams and legal tech teams hire young law students is the fact that it's unfair to ask law firms to teach them these technology and business skills because that's not what they're optimized for, right? When folks take a project to a law firm, a lot of times it's because they do want a human being to read every single, piece of paper from a kind of that compliance perspective. It's just, it isn't really the space, and with the billable hour and really less incentives there to go faster, right? It's not the optimal place to be training folks to kind of have these technical skills. That being said, the in-house space is one where, if you go home at 5 o'clock or 4 o'clock, you get paid the same, right? You just want to go home earlier to see your family. And so, those kinds of efficiencies, those kind of technologies, it's really incentivized for folks to adopt those. But my fear is that if you don't have in-house teams who are the teams that, are the ones that I think leverage this technology more and lean into it more, if you don't have them hiring directly from law schools, and you just have law schools sending folks directly to law firms, then those incentives will pass through the education. Because if I'm a law school, sure, you're going to take my student as an intern, but if you're not going to hire them, why would I spend the resources to shape my students to be tech forward, to work in-house, if they're not going to get, it's a little bit of chicken and egg, right? Because in-house is saying, hey, you're not training them to work here. And then schools are saying, well, you're not hiring them. So why would we train them to work for a job that is not existent, right? And so I think that once we can find a way to diversify the kind of first steps of law students, so they have opportunities to go into legal tech and they have opportunities to go into in-house, then some of these problems about education for technology will solve themselves, because then the incentives will fully align where we want to give you those skills. You can actually use those skills upon graduation versus keeping them in your back pocket until the next phase of your career 5 years down the line.
That's a great point, Memme. So Christy, I'll turn it back over to you for the last question.
Thank you, Doug. Well, it's very clear to me in listening to what everyone has been saying that all of you are really part of the solution, or trying your hardest to be part of the solution to this very difficult legal technology education chicken and egg issue, as Memme so well put it. So I would like to ask you, as we close the podcast, to give us all some hope. What are the 3 things you think will help change this dynamic and grow legal tech education in the near future? And please be as practical as you can be, so that we can inspire folks to be part of the solution as well. So I'm going to start this time. I'll give Bonnie a break going first all the time. I'm going to go the other way. I'm going to start with Memme first. Memme?
Awesome, cool. Yeah, I would say, and not to be a broken record, but if it's got to be 3, I'd say 1 is, in-house legal teams hiring directly from law school. I think 2 would be legal technology teams hiring directly from law school. And then I think lastly, it's just time. I mean, because at the end of the day, legal operations isn't even fully, it's something that's kind of naturally developed, that's not being taught in schools, right? There's not a place to learn about kind of, legal operations and all these things. So I think that this kind of stuff is just naturally occurring, and, it's been going in the right direction. I think if we give it more time, it'll land where it needs to be.
Sounds good. Mike, I'm going to ask you to go next.
So my pet peeve is that, we talk about, and I think it was Kat mentioned the technology competence requirements, right? 40 states and the ABA model rule comment. It has no teeth. It does not bite anybody. And I think that's the first thing that needs to change. We need to mandate legal technology as a course of study in law school. Frankly, it should be in undergraduate studies. I'm not saying teach e-discovery to undergrads, but I'm saying that you can't function today without technology. So why are we not teaching it more? 5-year-olds can use an iPad, but a middle-aged lawyer can't figure out how to use a database. It just doesn't make sense to me. We need to mandate that education, and students need to take that stand. I spent 20 years training incoming lawyers, and they would say to me, "What's e-discovery?" I never heard the words e-discovery throughout all of law school, and here I am teaching them how to use a database, how to search, and how to process data. like students need to take a stand. And I don't know if that's like students going in or if faculty need to take the lead on that, hint Kat. And then lastly, I think one thing that I found really helpful, that my third thing is there needs to be a financial support system for this. And I found that the UK does this well. The UK has what's called a tax levy that corporations of a certain size have to set aside a certain amount of money for training. And that removes the financial burden or disincentives that many firms, in fact, organizations everywhere, will have to invest in training people so that they get better at their jobs. I think we need some kind of program like that. I'm not aware of one in the United States.
Great, that's awesome. Kat, can you address, can you give us your 3 things and perhaps address some of what Mike just said?
Well, I'll just say, Mike, that the first thing I did in getting to Vanderbilt, I'm in year 5 now, was reinstitute our e-discovery course. So we have a dedicated course, so Vanderbilt law students come out, and it's included in other courses so that students come out at least understanding what it is. Some come out really, really knowledgeable, for what that's worth. So I would say a primary thing we need is awareness, and this really ties into what everyone has said so far. States have these, this model rule that is very vague with no teeth, although 2 states, North Carolina and Florida, do require technology competency as part of their CLE requirements, for what that's worth. But we need to clearly identify technology competency as a competency for lawyers. And this is part of my mission in creating the Delta model for lawyer competency. Technology appears prominently. It ties into the fundamental work that we do. And so when we can communicate and present very clearly to law students starting in law school that this is part of the tool set you need, the toolkit you need in order to do your work effectively and ethically, then we really reset the rules for the game, right? And that's going to require a lot of commitment, systemic, from legal education going outward. I will also say that beyond the competency and self-awareness, we also, excuse me, just need more time.
All right, Bonnie, please, over to you.
Doug and Christy, everything, my 3 dovetail off of everything that Mike and Kat have just said. So firstly, I think that there needs to be a cultural shift. And I feel like everybody's sort of looking at this, but not quite doing it in the industry. There needs to be a cultural shift toward law firms, law schools, lawyers saying, hey, this is my technical competence, bragging about it, advertising it, achieving it. And there needs to be more specificity to comment 8, right? So what does it mean specifically that you need to understand the risks and benefits of using technology, right? So what does that mean exactly? And finally, my third thing, Florida's CLE credits are only 3. How about the entire country adopting a much greater CLE requirement? Because that's an obligation. That education is an obligation. So really the whole thing, I think, for me is a cultural shift, but then more specificity, as both Mike and Kat have indicated, in exactly what that requirement needs to be.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been an amazing discussion. I'm going to turn it over to Doug, but I just want to thank you all so much for opening my eyes to so many new ideas and concepts and sharing your expertise. It's really been great having you today. Doug, over to you for the closing.
Thanks, Christy. Yes, great discussion today. Really appreciate all your terrific insights and comments. And I want to thank Bonnie, Kat, Mike, and Memme for being our guests on He Said, She Said. And to Christy, again, for always being an excellent She Said, my He Said. So look forward to seeing y'all next time. Goodbye.